Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I apologize, we had a little bit of a technical difficulty. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the second part in our three-part series on racial equity and corporate governance. My name is Mike Callahan, and I am a professor of the practice and executive director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford Law School, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we get started, just a couple of thanks and acknowledgements. First, Stanford Law School would like to thank and acknowledge Chief Justice Leo Strine for his vision in conceiving of this conference and connecting all three institutions to advance these important discussions. Second, I would like to thank my colleagues and co-sponsors of this event at the Stanford Center for Racial Justice, as well as my colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania Institute for Law and Economics and the Columbia Law School Milstein Center for Global Markets and Corporate Ownership. It has been a real pleasure to get to work with all of you as we plan this series. A quick note on logistics for our participants for today's discussion. We will have a discussion among this panel for, let's call it about 45 minutes past the hour, and then I'll open it up to audience Q&A. I would ask if you would please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions, and I will moderate the Q&A session from there. And also, as you were just notified, we are recording this event to share it on our institutional websites in the future. So now on to some brief introductions of our panelists. You can find all the details of their broad and significant accomplishments and distinctions on our conference webpage or just on the internet in general. So I won't spend too much time here. Just briefly introduce them and then we can get to the good stuff. So first up, Pat Waters is the Chief People Officer at Procore Technologies, previously the Chief Talent Officer at ServiceNow and at LinkedIn, and she's also a board member at Accolade and Zenefits. Pat, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Dane Holmes is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Eskalera, and formerly a partner, an executive vice president, and the global head of human capital management at Goldman Sachs. Welcome, Dane. Thank you. Fong Phillips is the Chief Legal Officer at Zynga, and formerly the Associate General Counsel for Tesla and Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Solar City. Fong, thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.
And Jonathan McBride is an advisor to boards, CEOs, and executive teams, and formerly a managing director and global head of inclusion and diversity at BlackRock. And before that, he was at the White House for 5 years as an assistant to President Barack Obama. Jonathan, thank you for being here. And so now on to our discussion today. We'd like to frame the work this afternoon to examine strategies and approaches for boards and executive leaders to advance inclusion and racial equity at their companies. And as part of this discussion, we'll try and cover issues related to how leaders can address some of the important constituents in this area, including investors, their own employees, and the corporate role in the community. And also, given that this is a corporate governance conference and an experienced corporate governance audience, obviously the roles of boards and management teams are different, and we will distinguish that in some of these approaches, but our goal today is to leave you as an audience with some practical takeaways, learning from the expertise and perspectives of our panelists today. And so first, I'd like to start at a high level with Dane and Pat to talk a little bit about what is the mindset shift that you see as necessary and some practical ways to have that conversation for board members in the executive suite to get their organizations focused on these deeper topics of inclusion and broader racial equity. The topic of diversity in the boardroom, diversity in the C-suite, that's been going on for some time, but how do you get to that next level conversation?
Sure, and maybe I'll start off and then I'll pass it on to Jonathan as well. I think there's really two mind shifts that need to happen, and obviously they translate starting at the board, moving down to management. So it's both something that needs to happen at the board level, but also that, frankly, obviously they're trying to take temperature on as it relates to their management. And that is going from a kind of risk compliance mindset, much more to an opportunity and strategic mindset. And so I think for a lot of companies, they view this as a issue, almost like sometimes it could be an event, and they could be treating what's happening in our recent environment as an event. And that creates traditional crisis responses and other things that are all built on the concept that this will go away soon. And I think that it is different this time. And I think it's different this time, not just because this time is different. I think it's different because the breadcrumbs of the change that we're seeing have been out there for a long time. The green shoots that have happened are there. And this is about an evolutionary dynamic. So I think, first of all, go from a risk mindset to kind of an opportunity mindset. And then also, normally when you're going into a risk mindset or a crisis, you think about marketing. And so it's a lot about what can I do from a marketing perspective? How do I think about my brand and all that? But when you move to strategy, you think about operations and you think about the core processes and things that you devote your time to in trying to make that transition. And so I would say the other thing is, if you're having a conversation that's a lot about branding, look at our new advertisements that we have. Oh, we have this new event we're going to do and all those kind of things. You're very deeply in the marketing world and you're acting like you're in a crisis. If you're having a discussion which is more, take me through your pipeline of how you think about succession planning and how you promote people to move through the organization, or how you bring people into the organization, or how do you get rid of, ineffective leaders who don't diverse teams, then you're deep in the strategy mode. And that's the operational part. And so I think those are two mind shifts that probably need to take place.
Yeah, and I'm happy to chime in here too. Completely agree with you, Dane. I think that you want to take something that's a moment into a movement. And so it's got to get into the DNA of an organization, into its mindset. I think, Mike, what's changing also is that we realize that D&I is necessary, but not sufficient. And we've learned that over time. It gets our intellectual brain going. We understand the numbers representation. We can get the business argument of why diverse teams win, so to speak. But if we have that virtual leaky bucket in the organization, if we haven't fixed the core of the organization, you'll never achieve the outsized rewards you get from a real diverse, inclusive organization. And so I think what's happening is this awareness is evolving, especially in 2020, that you have to build up your culture from the ground floor up. You have to create it in every moment that matters, to address the biases that exist, to make sure it's in the DNA of how you recruit and put in your strategies, Dane, as you said, so it's always in there and always part of it, and stop the leaky bucket. And you should be looking at diversity inclusion, not just at a macro overview standpoint, which we used to do all the time. Like we have X number of representation here versus there, but really at the fundamental team level, right? And how are you creating healthy teams and healthy leaders? And that will change the stem of how things evolve and change engagement. It makes us smarter when we have diverse teams. We get better output, better product, better services, and it creates a better outcome for our customers. And so that retention and changing culture, I think, is getting more mind share.
And Mike, may I add, for Zynga, for us, it was understanding who our customers are, right? And realizing that, Zynga, most of our players happen to be women, and we're a gaming company. And I think most people instinctively believe that it's a boys sort of scene, but it really isn't. 65% of our players happen to be women aged 35 to 65. And so I have a wonderful board where when I first joined Zynga, the topic was D&I. How do we make our company, our leaders, as well as our employees, look like our customers? And so I think that's where it starts. It has to start from the very top.
Terrific. Well, let's talk a little bit about, I like this conversation around mindset shift, and the mindset shift about thinking about going deeper beyond just, Pat, your point of we have X percentage of employees who represent this group, to that next level. Those expectations are coming from not just inside the company and from customers, but from a number of different constituents. And importantly, institutional investors have said a lot publicly about what they plan to do in this area. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about how those expectations from the large institutional investors will evolve in terms of that. How should C-suite and board members engage with institutional investors? And will this be part of the broader ESG conversation? And we're fortunate, Jonathan, you spent time at one of those investors, and Dane, you did as well. You guys could talk a little bit about your perspective on that challenge and that expectation.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, Dane, and then you can pile on top. But I would say a couple of things, just building off some of the earlier comments. This is moving from, if you Google crisis management, you get a lot of advice on crisis communications, not how to actually manage through. And so people have been using kind of approaches to kind of get past this, but the cost of inactivity on these topics is going up, I think, and investors are paying attention. But to specifically answer your question, I'd use a model that I actually stole friend of mine who was working on ESG investing at BlackRock, which is, if you believe that the trends in the marketplace towards transparency are going to continue to go up, meaning as consumers, individuals, communities, they're going to want more information about groups and organizations and companies they are working for or working with. If you believe that, and if you believe that consumers, whether consuming a job, a prospective employee, or a product or service, have access to that information, and there are three choices that are roughly the same, and one has better information or data than the other, then the third question as an investor you have to ask yourself is what happens to the talent pool and then corresponding performance and stock price of the company with the least good data over time. So if you believe that the trend towards transparency goes up, those next two things are almost necessary conclusions. And the challenge for employers and for places of work is that moving these numbers is hard. So if you get exposed, it takes you a long time to react. Now, investors have jumped ahead and they've created indices in Europe and the United States where you're now starting to be able to invest on this thesis. So you can invest in more diverse companies or more inclusive companies. And that trend seems to be growing as people are trying to find more of the S in ESG every single day. And so if you add on top of those three questions, a fourth question, which what if people can invest this way with the same transparency and money can move quickly in and out of publicly traded companies, you kind of have your answer as to how investors are likely to play this. Dane, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, just I'll say I remember when we talked about this when I was at Goldman, I was responsible for doing the corporate governance engagement there and building out our first kind of ESG team. And I remember people like saying, this is going to go away. This is going to fade. And so that was a good 8 years ago. So I think this is a trend that, only the fool denies is going to happen. What I will say about investors, and if I was sitting on a board or a management team, what I'd be focused on is investors only move in one direction, which is they become more demanding. They never become less demanding. That trend doesn't reverse. That's not how it works. And, I've tended to see a pattern that they usually have, which is first they want data, because that's the nature of who they are. They're analytical by nature. So they're going to want to grab the data. Then they're going to want to understand what the risks are coming out of that data. Then they're going to want to plan a strategic plan. Okay, I have the data. I understand the risks. Like, what's your plan? And then they're going to look for progress, right? That's the nature of what they do. And then at some point, they'll be at this crossroads of what I would call is almost a cultural decision of, do I think this company has the right mindset, the right culture, the precedents for success in place to actually turn this into an opportunity? And if the answer to that is no, they sell it or they turn over management. And if the answer to that is yes, then they double down. But it'll go along that path. And so, this is, once again, I know we're going to hit this over the head, this idea of looking at it as a crisis. When you have crisis events with investors, you kind of go in there, you want to tell them you understand it, you want them to move on to something else. That's not going to happen in this space. The expectations are just going to grow and grow and grow and grow. So you want to get ahead of them as quick as you can.
And Dane, one thing I just add, in addition, kind of thinking as a practitioner, because managers are managing groups of people who more and more are not like themselves. If you're an investor in a company and their management isn't interrupting those biases for the managers, there is no way they're optimizing your expense line when it comes to compensation.
For sure.
Because there's no way they're getting the best out of every single person. And you're already paying them. You're paying them every single year, but they're getting some fraction of those people worth, because mainly the people more like themselves are giving them more ideas, and the people less like themselves are not a part of the conversation.
Totally agree.
And where along, and so Dane, on that spectrum, you talked about how investors evolve their engagement, and Jonathan, your point as well. Where do you think we are on that spectrum now, is between data, culture, and evaluating? And so boards, board members are watching.
Where the nose is struggling to get out of the water. I mean, we are at the very beginning of it. The data is just, we're at the tips of it. And, even for companies who've been invested in it for a long time, the data that they look at is actually not the best data for two reasons. One, they're not looking at data through the lens often of a process. So when you look at representation is an output, it's not an input. The data that you want to look at is an input, just like you would if you're looking at a sales or a product deployment. You'd look at the chain. You wouldn't look at where did we end up. You'd look at like, what were all the inputs into ending up there? And so I think you're at the early stages of that. And then I think the second one that everybody has to acknowledge is that this is about culture, and very few people are doing things to measure culture. And so the real data you want is the cultural data of why is it that we keep making the decision to go left versus right? What is it institutionally around our culture that creates that outcome? And until you have an understanding of that, it's very, very hard for you to fix as a consequence. So I think we are at super early games. And if you think about 2/3 of the population is diverse, right? If you, in the US, if you say it's about 2/3, 50% women, then you take Black, Hispanic, and you put your other groups in, it's about 2/3. How many people have spent 2/3 of their energy trying to figure this out? Very few.
Yeah, and I would double down on the fact that we have not been measuring the E and the I enough. We've been very content to measure the D. And by the way, we usually measure the D on intake from campus. We're obsessed with our campus recruiting hiring numbers, but not the overall organization and lateral hiring numbers. But and when we do look at the E&I, if we have an employee opinion survey, it's like I have an 83 average response to this score, but we're not looking at what's the gap between the happiest and least happy people in my organization on a specific team, because those gaps are the bigger difference. If you have a lower average score, but the gap is 4 percentage points between the happiest and least happy, and another company has higher percentage, but the gap is 15, I would say the first company is doing a better job at delivering a consistent experience, and maybe they want to average up the band, but that is not a conversation most companies are having. And there's certainly, and this is the last piece of it, even if we have the data, until we reward and penalize or incentivize this the same way we do every other business priority in an organization, it's not going to be fully realized. So until it's tied to comp and year-end reviews and promotion processes and part of an interview process coming in, it won't be the same way any other strategic goal, operational goal, cost goal, whatever the case may be, will be for the organization.
Yeah, that's a great, and I want to get to that exact comp and what other strategies companies can employ here. But let's take this transition. You just mentioned employees, Jonathan. I'd like to ask Pat and Fawn to talk a little bit about how boards and how C-suite can start to demonstrate leadership with their own employees in this critical area. So employees are obviously the most critical asset for all companies. They're increasingly more vocal on social media, and particularly through this experience, as Dane and Jonathan mentioned, it's not going away and expectations are going to be high. So how are your organizations thinking about it, and what practical advice do you have for board members and executive leaders on that front?
Pat, would you like to take this one first, or would you like me to start?
Why don't you start?
Sure. So for us, it's all about recruiting and retention, right? And when you say employees, right now during this pandemic, virtually, it's impossible to really set forth the culture that Jonathan and Dane are talking about. And so how do we do that? And how do we show that we're making a difference? And for us, what we've discovered is that all of our employee resource groups, they're the ones that are creating this culture. They're the ones that are sort of forthcoming with all this information. And so our board and our management team have worked very closely with the ERGs to ask them specifically, what is it that you need from us? How can we fulfill some of the concerns that you have and explain away some of the other concerns that you are sometimes afraid to speak out about, especially given that everything's virtual right now. And so I think the key here is to have those meetings, and it can't be one of those meetings where come and talk to me, the whole group, right? It's like have those one-on-one conversations. And I know that my management team, every one of us, we are the executive sponsor of an ERG. We will talk to the board members, and then we will then take it back to C-staff, and then also bring it up to the board members and say, these are the things that are really concerning the employees at this time. And so that has really helped with our recruiting, and that has really helped with just retention in general.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. I mean, for sure, listening, like leverage your ERGs within the organization. What I've been pursuing, Mike, as you know, is that sense of belonging. So D&I is necessary, but it's not sufficient, because if you have that leaky bucket, you will lose the talent that you've been courting so long. And the cost of churn is high. And it's a huge cost, not only in replacing the talent, but a cost on your talent brand. And so if you think about the marketplace, if you think about your future opportunity, culture is set by every decision, every act that we do at work, right? Virtually or physically. And those trends over time become the stories that we tell each other and become our public brand. And so by listening and adapting and learning is really, really incredibly important, but not overreacting in a crisis. To Dane's earlier point, like if this year alone has taught me anything, if you have a crisis that you deem in front of you and you're not sure how to react, address the issue, your first step, your first immediate step should not be a public statement of, I'll address it. Your first step should be go inside your organization, say, what should we be doing better? Your first step should be looking inside and saying, here's our principles. Are we living our principles? Are we making the right decisions first for us and for our future selves? And if not, why not? And let's course correct and hold ourselves accountable. And accountability can show up in a myriad of ways, to Jonathan's point, right? It could be rewards, it could be consequences, but it should definitely be a factor of your career success. If you're not living a principle-based decision-making, inclusive, belonging culture, then you shouldn't be a leader in our organization. I mean, it should be very clear, right? Giving me a financial reward may not be as motivating as saying, I don't have a career with you, right? You might have to pursue a different career somewhere else. But setting up a listening way throughout your organization, pick your vehicle, right? But you should be actively listening, sharing what you've heard, and what are you going to do about it? And then iterating on that. You can't boil the ocean, but you got to pick the lane and walk it and then report out what did you do. But don't go out and say you're going to do something and then try to figure out what that thing is, because it won't be trusted.
And I would say the key is really be thoughtful, slow down, right? I think oftentimes when there is a crisis, everyone's so quick to respond, and that's when they get in trouble because they say very broad general statements that they can never really execute upon. So for us, it's like, you never want to be the first one out the door. Just think about what people are saying, what they're asking for, and then collectively as a unit, decide what's best for the company and then make your statement. But don't be the first one to say, we're going to do this, or we're not going to do this, because who knows that's what the company wants and the employees want.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Pat and Fong said, and not to throw another scoop of ice cream of the similar flavor on top of the sundae. The other reason I think people shouldn't do it is they have to first acknowledge the fact that they don't know what they're doing. Most people have not devoted the time and energy to understand the complexity of the issues, and most senior leaders, frankly, are so far away from it. They're so elevated out of it that they're at risk, and it's as a result, I think the first thing, not just because it's a good strategy to listen and learn, is you have to listen and learn because you actually don't know. You don't know at that level what's going on, and the reason that you don't know is because you're having to rush to respond. Because if you knew, you would have already been taking steps. This didn't happen once. I like to remind people when they say, oh, George Floyd was a real turning point. I was like, no, if you look in the African-American community, we can list all the names, and it's been going on for a long time. So it's not new. It's just new to you. And you need to take that first step to acknowledging it's new to you. And that means you got to listen to others that are a little bit more entrenched in it.
And how would you say, I mean, let's pull on this thread a little bit. So a board and a management team that doesn't understand the issues Fong talked about and Pat talked about, listening to the employee base. What other strategies would you advise boards and executive leaders, and this is for anybody, and how to educate themselves, recognizing that many don't understand the issues the way they need to really make change here?
I think this program is a good start. And I also would encourage our board members to attend seminars on learning a little bit more about it. And I think, that's what our board has asked us, which is, what is it that you want us to focus on this year? And we try to give them two things that they want to focus on, and DE&I was one of them. And so each time there is a programming like this, I would send it to them and say, hey, this is an opportunity for you to learn more about it. So I think it's about education and finding ways to make it easy for them to be educated and not being lectured.
The other thing I'll throw out there that might get everybody on a board to hate me, I'll become the most unliked man on the planet. And this has to be done in the right way. But I would go back, most boards maybe get an annual checkup of diversity. And I would have them go back and ask for the last 2 presentations they had on it. And then look at it, not to judge, not to assess, not to critique management, but from the lens of, were we even asking the right questions? Are we treating this like a subject that is of strategic importance? Are we being honest about our shortcomings or not? And a little bit use it as a moment to let's go back, not to re-prosecute or to point angle at the failure, but to actually learn and grow it. This isn't the first time the subject's come across our boardroom. how are we engaging it? And how do we feel like we engaged in that subject versus other subjects that might have been acquisitions or expanding a new business? And do we think we had as robust and pointed and directive a conversation about this area as we did it at that? And if not, what things would change? And so I think, you'll repeat history if you don't learn from it. I'd go back and look at your board history and look at it and just say, okay, how do we want it to feel and act differently this time around?
Yeah, and Mike, I would add to that a couple things. One would be, as a board member, your role is oftentimes asking the right question, right, to prompt the right behaviors. And so asking yourself the question, do we really understand what it's like to work for this organization at multiple levels, across multiple functions, across multiple geographies? And if we know that, from whom and how do we know that? Just asking yourself that question and making sure you're stress testing it. The second thing is, it's not that often. My boss at BlackRock presented at Investor Day once, and it was a really big, there's a really, really positive response, but it just got me to notice that there are not that many heads of HR that presented at Investor Day. And yet we're talking about these issues, and the head of HR is responsible for building the team that's going to deliver on everything else everyone's reporting on that day during Investor Day. So it feels like, having that person, be part of the investor conversation is particularly important. And then going back to the board meetings, not just relying on the top couple of people to come through, but have the next level managers come through on a steady basis and have to give you their reports directly and be accountable to you is a great way to incentivize behavior, because people don't want to come back the second time and not have a report that isn't significantly better. So building yourself down maybe one more level of accountability into the organization is a great way to spur activity faster.
Those are great suggestions. Before we get into the theme of measurement and accountability, I want to talk about one more constituency that, as you've all seen, corporations have made a lot of commitments externally about not just what they want to do with their workforces, but what they want to do in their community, whether it's customers and suppliers or business partners. And that's kind of you can debate whether that's the role of a corporation or not. And I think one of our audience members has a question about that. But I'd like to talk about the strategies that should be thought about. And Fong and Jonathan, if you can talk a little bit about, if you're a board and you're thinking about this broader community side, what should you be thinking about in that area?
Well, I'll speak on the side of hiring legal counsel, because that's what I sort of control. And the truth is, you and I talked about this, Mike, earlier, which is sometimes there's no leverage, right? It depends on what size your company is compared to your vendors, et cetera. But for me, it's easier on the legal counsel side, because when I try to hire outside counsel, I make a huge effort to tell my team that they have to interview at least 3 law firms, with one law firm being completely diverse. And it has to be real, right? Don't send me all of your minorities and then all of a sudden they don't even do the work. And that, that to me is the most frustrating piece. And for outside legal counsel, money talks. And so they obviously will change their procedures and habits if enough in-house lawyers and general counsel say to them, we won't hire you. You will not get hired if you do not show up with a diverse team. And I know there's been a lot of conversations about that, excuse me, dogs barking, in the last couple of years. And so it's what I can do to contribute, which is I can make a difference. I'm really sorry. I can make a difference in the legal hiring of legal counsel in that way.
Your dog's cheering you on, Fong.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. She's going, go, Paul. Go. Yeah,
it's a doggy version of an amen. That's what I was thinking.
There's no apologies in Zoom land. We all have our own distractions. Jonathan, you were going to say.
Listen, I think this goes to some of the comments you heard earlier, particularly from Pat around authenticity. The point here, so to Dane's point about this happening over time, if you go back to 2016, where you had somebody turn their car into a weapon in Nice, and an Orlando nightclub shooting, and then a series of black men and boys being shot over the course of the summer, if you're in the Western Hemisphere, and then a cop shot in Dallas, you would have thought, after all the pronouncements at the end of that period of time, that all these companies were going to change the way they operated internally and externally, and it just didn't really happen. So I think the lesson learned is that big one-off announcements, or doing things that are completely out of character or different, or investing in organizations you've never really spent much time with and don't have an ongoing relationship with, are momentary. They're kind of like crisis communications. They're getting you through that moment. If any one of the companies that make big pronouncements in 2016 had stuck with 2 or even 1 major change that was different today, 1, the next change they would ask, the second and third would be easier. And two, they'd be very proud of themselves because they'd be in the top couple percent. So deciding where you are on these issues, and you can decide what your sense of purpose is and how much to communicate. But the point is to be authentic and be aligned throughout your organization. And then in these moments, rather than doing something extraordinary, be a slightly better version of yourself. Do one thing or two things and stick with them and stay at them, because the courage coming out of this summer is going to be next summer still talking about this past summer. That will be a sign of courage, actually, because you're going to be probably one of the handful of companies doing it.
Totally agree.
Well said. Pat, go ahead, sorry.
No, I just totally agree with what you just said, Jonathan. I think that when things are hard and you treat it like a moment, you want it behind you. And this is something that needs to be in front of you and with you all the time. Every decision matters. And so creating those decision points and those measuring points along the employee life cycle or a company journey is critical. So you chase what I call the right rabbit, right? You don't get distracted. You pick the one thing. I believe in creating a healthy, high-performing company that can scale. And healthy means this. That means everything that the company does is done fairly, with intentionality, with learning, by putting the right tools in the hands of managers and leaders and the board. It means having regular conversations at the comp committee and broadening their remit, perhaps as their charter for the org health, talent health. And that includes this topic. So it is part of the rigor that you just don't get to put behind you. If you do that, then after that meeting, you check a box and you think you've accomplished something, and that is the wrong thing we want.
And I would say, just to pick up on what Pat was saying, it's easier to be for something than against the things that pop up periodically. So if you have an affirmative statement, this is what we believe and this is how we think about it, and that's your response over time to these things, then you can speak up regularly, but you're kind of saying similar things and reinforcing. But it also people will give you the benefit of the doubt when they know where you stand. So one of the coaches in the NBA in the bubble decided not to kneel, which normally would have been a crisis with his players when they were in the bubble going through this whole thing. But it wasn't, because he was so outspoken on these things for so long. And his whole point was, I just don't want to politicize the bubble, but I'm with you. And everybody knew he was with them, so he didn't get any grief. And so the point is, like, once you establish that you're really, really for something, it also relieves you of the pressure of having to be against everything that comes up in every derivative.
Yeah. And I think what I've leaned into is being perfectly imperfect on this journey, because it's so personalized, even within sub-communities, that what makes me feel that sense of belonging and health, and that I belong in your organization, I can be my most authentic self, may differ. And so, having situational leadership, understanding that we got to be perfectly imperfect in the journey, but as leaders, we must lean in. Like, there is no doubt in my mind that we have a responsibility to the ecosystem, our customers, our employees, their families, and the board and the investors on how to do this the right way, because the cost is too great for us not to.
Yeah, so we've looked at mindset. We've talked about some of the constituencies and the change that needs to happen. Let's talk about I think, Pat, you just said something about this, which I want to dig in on with you and Dane, which is the hard part of measurement and accountability. Specifically, we can define what diversity is in terms of the numbers of people coming in, but inclusion is hard to define. Equity is really hard to define. But how do you talk to your management teams and boards about those issues? What do you measure? What do you track to see that you're making progress there?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. So, this is partially why I left Goldman to create the company Eskalera, is because we're in the business of measuring culture. But I'm not going to turn this into an Eskalera commercial. But I think what matters is, are you measuring those cultural things? And for us, we define inclusion as being, growth mindset, belonging, voice, and trust as like the kind of the core components. And so, are you measuring those? My most important thing, though, about this, and I think we really have to get out in the world, is this understanding that all of those factors are directly correlated to high performance. Right. So we talk about it as inclusion. And so to that extent, I tend to take D, E, and I reverse it. I say, what you have is an inclusive culture. What you make sure is that culture is equitably distributed, and the output is diversity. Diversity is an output. The input is inclusion. The process is, am I equitably doing that inclusion? It's not just happening in one part of the firm, or, hey, we're really inclusive when you join the firm, but once you've been here 5 years, you know, like, is it equitably distributed? Does it apply to recruitment, promotion, job opportunity? How equitable is it? And if it is, if by definition you'll get a diverse output, because otherwise what you're implying is that there's only certain people who can be successful. And if there's anything that we have seen, despite all of the obstacles, is that talent is ubiquitous. And so if you're not getting diverse outcomes, it's because you're creating a process. You either don't have the culture or you don't have the equitable distribution of that culture in a way that creates that outcome. That outcome should be a matter of, you know, just outcome. It should be what drives it. So, you know, that's what I would, you know, kind of push aggressively for people and how they think about defining those terms, if you want to use it that way.
Yeah, I align with Dane. I think I look at it slightly different. I do the same reverse architecture. I look at belonging, right? Do I have a sense of belonging? Am I authentic self? Am I willing to speak up? Have the psychological safety? Do you get the most of me in that dialogue, that rumble, as Brene Brown would say? Because if I don't feel safe, you get less of my thought, right? You get less of me. And that's where we have, you know, underperformance. And then inclusion is, I know that you're going to treat me fair. You're going to pay me equitably. I'm going to have opportunity. You're going to support me in my needs and be there for me when I need care. And the output is diversity, because if I get that, then you get diversity of thought and you get more people that look like me or willing to be different than me to come in and rumble on a given topic. And so how we measure. So Mike, the practical things I look at in measuring are, you know, diversity, inclusion, belonging, metrics across our employee engagement surveys to make sure we're listening all the time, pulsing. Can you be authentic? Do you have psychological safety? Do you feel you can speak up with a different point of view and be heard? So on and so, because that's really the crux of the learning. And then we talk about fair pay. Do you understand how you're paid? Do you feel like you're paid fairly? And we run all that analysis and we make things that would otherwise be a black box into transparent transactions. So people know the pay methodology, they know where they sit in market, they know the decision making that goes in it. So if you put in light into a dark spot, people gain trust. And if I'm wrong, you will tell me and I will fix it. And if I'm right, what an opportunity to educate. And so I think transparency, although can be scary, is a gift.
And Mike, I'll just add a couple of things. One, something I learned from Pat, but it's really important. We've been measuring inclusion for a long time, which is really asking how are our policies, how are our managers doing, how are our teams doing? And belonging is an individual answer of whether it's working for me or not. So it's shifting the locus to an individual review of how you're doing, not this like, hey, how are we doing? As is, you know, conversation about equity, that's a question about fairness. Is it fair? That's a very hard question to ask people. But two questions I bet people in the audience are having. The first is, are these like science experiments? Well, only if you don't believe in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because just above like air and water, you have safety, psychological safety. And the next thing is belongingness. Before self-realization, affirmation, all those other things that most of our incentive systems are about. You got to feel safe and you got to feel like you belong before those other incentives really start to take hold. And another question is like, aren't we talking about quotas? Only if we talk about marketing quotas, sales quotas, operational quotas, which we don't. We talk about targets so people can shoot for things and they never make it. They're a little high, they're a little low, but we have those targets to focus people's minds on the things that matter most, except for when it comes to the people who are actually doing the focusing and the composition of those teams. And that's a huge mistake. So people like to use the word quotas only in this part of the discussion, which is like a line you have to get above. But what we're talking about is targets like any other part of the business.
Yeah, and maybe, Mike, just one last thing I'll put. The other thing, there's a whole set of diversity metrics that people should run that aren't traditionally viewed as diversity metrics. They're basically what I call myth-buster diversity metrics. So people say things like, if you're an asset manager, tenure really, really matters. You know, we've decided that you have to have 10 years tenure as a portfolio manager before you can be successful. And then I always say to them, okay, you're using that to sort all the people you recruit, all these things. What's the analysis you have that supports that? Have you done an analysis that shows that if you're here 10 years or longer, that actually you outperform other portfolio managers? And the answer is, well, no, but we just know it. I was like, no, you don't. You don't know it. It's a mythology that you tell yourself. And if you're going to actually use it to make decisions, it should be data backed. Like, hey, we do better when we homegrown our people. Is that true? Have you done analysis about people who've been at your firm the last 4 years or the last 5 years and who's actually outperforming? Oh, well, to be a salesperson, you have to grow up in sales. Is that true? What is the data that you looked at? So there's all of this, these kind of premises that are laid up front that end up creating all of these strange outcomes, but yet they're based on no data. No data that proves that they're right. And in my experience, in most cases, when I looked at the data, they were actually counterfactual. They actually weren't the driver. It used to be, hey, this person's so commercial. It's because they're so commercial that they're not a good manager. They're just obsessive about the client. Well, we did our analysis. That was not true. The most commercial people were the people who were the best managers. And you could do all kinds of versions of this.
Yeah, I think that I love this theme of boards demanding the data and looking back at prior presentations on these issues and really trying to understand where in the organization this is being handled and how it's been broken down. And on that, I want to do one more with the panel on exec comp. Starbucks recently announced a plan quite publicly about how they're going to try to compensate execs based on making progress in this area. And so Pat and Fawn, you probably spend a lot of time with comp committees. If you want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in exec comp in terms of trends that work, and then I'll start to look at the Q&A tab here. And so for the audience, I see some people are using the chat tab. I'm not able to monitor both on the screen here. So if you can get your question in the Q&A tab, I'll try to get to it there. Thanks. And so please, exec comp, let's talk about that.
Pat, feel free to start because you are the HR expert here.
I'm always a learner, but thank you for thinking I'm an expert. So I think there are some thoughts that are going into the compensation reward, incentivizing consequences, either in the incentive pay or some consideration, Mike. I think when you actually look at incentives, it should be the holistic view, in my opinion. Now, I have not worked with an organization that put that into its metrics, but I do put it into the promotability and the opportunity for promotion and succession planning. It's in like a balanced scorecard. Like if you are not leading a healthy, diverse, safe, inclusive workforce culture, then you will not have that promotion consideration. That it means people deserve great leaders. And so even with outsized results, so to speak, if they don't have a healthy culture that they're leading through, then that they won't get that opportunity. And so it's putting way more weight into building the right culture and the right accountability versus a monetary point in time. I think I'll be interested in see what my peers are going to learn through this process, but I think having a balanced scorecard and making it in the top 4 of consideration for being a leader in any org should be highly considered.
And I would say compensation does play a big role into it, I would imagine, right? And so you could think about it as doing an annual bonus, or for a long-term incentive, you can think about granting a performance grant where it's not something that vests over, say, a quarter or a year, but it's super long-term. And so it actually allows you to be a little bit far-reaching in terms of your goals for DI. So I think those are options. Again, we haven't looked into it as well, but it's all very fresh and new and probably up for consideration, I imagine, in the next few months.
Yeah, I got to think that you're going to start to hear from investors and questions about that as larger companies start to launch these things, right? And how it trickles down. I don't know, Dane or Jonathan, if you have any thoughts on those issues.
I have one, I'll take the other edge, and I'm just doing this to take the other edge a little bit to be edgy. Because I think that in the end of the day, if people don't feel like it drives how they're paid or promoted, then, I deeply agree with, I think Jonathan made the comment earlier, it just doesn't matter. But also what's interesting about DE&I is it's, I think, both for a lot of companies, a strategic imperative that they need to understand. So from both their people and their customer perspective, but for a lot of companies, it's also a value one. And the reason I raise that is that if it is both strategic and values, then you're in a no fault zone. And what I mean by that is it's a requirement, right? So just as you would say, for someone to get paid or to be in that role, it's not just like, hey, I'd like you to do well on this. It's like, if you don't have a track record of doing well on this, you literally can't have the job. And so when you get to that level, it becomes less about the incentive of how do I convince someone, how do I convince my puppy to take a pill by wrapping cheese around it. It's really much more of a like, we're not even considering you. You didn't even get through the gate if you don't have a track record of showing that you're really good at this. Just like the head of sales wouldn't become the head of sales if they don't have a track record of being good at sales. If it's a priority, you have to have a track record. So I think incentives can be difficult. They can create unintended consequences. They can definitely create a lot of backlash. But you can also put stakes in the ground and just say, this is a requirement to be a leader of this level in our organization. And if you don't have a demonstrated history of being able to do it, you're not part of it. So you probably need a little bit of both.
Mike, the one thing I'll just add really quickly is when I mentioned that investors are finding ways to invest on this thesis, in most cases, because it just for an efficiency standpoint, the only way they can do it is by, culling data that's publicly available on each company. And so they're looking at things that are going to be represented in their website and other mechanisms. And so anything you can demonstrate that's clear kind of prioritization of this, which could be in a promotion process, compensation of senior executives, a criteria for, even being hired into the company as a manager, whatever the case may be. Over time, whatever you both can prove you're doing and that are willing to put on your website and talk to the world about is going to help you in those indices. And if you do better than your peers, more money will come into you for public company.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you all. So let's turn to some questions here, and I'll do my best to pick a few out. There's a question which I think is an interesting one about the broader sense of corporate governance, which is this question about why are corporations better suited or well suited at addressing gender and racial issues in general, like sort of the role of a corporation in society as opposed to a government or some other institution that would traditionally try to make change here. And so I'll pick on Jonathan because we cited your robust government experience in the intro here about why you think it's corporations that should take the lead here. Or if you believe that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, listen, I think our big issues are going to be, solved across sectorally. I have seen, it's definitely been the case in the last 4 or 5 years as governments that used to be more forward leaning on this have taken a step back, that corporations have either stepped in or been pulled into that conversation, particularly CEOs. And you see that in the Edelman Trust data, where employers in the last 3 years of a 20-year study have emerged as the organization people most want to trust and most put confidence in. And it's the CEO, by the way, in particular, that's a really high percentage of that. So, whether I can't say a chicken and egg, I don't know if companies stepped in or if they were pulled into that void, but, it used to be governments leading that charge. And it could easily happen again. You had pay gap data disclosures in the UK. They were thinking about doing ethnicity and race after that. There was a change in government, so it didn't happen. The US was 6 months behind at that point. Change in government didn't happen. Then it happened for 1 year and then we went back. But the point is, you could see governments picking up pace. And I have a feeling for all of you who are trying to predict this, there's going to be a little bit of activity around this in Washington this spring, because you already saw it over the past year with new committees being set up in the Finance Committee and other places where you're likely to see more executive orders and more conversation about this that are going to prompt you to activity. But the private sector can move faster. The private sector employs more people than the public sector does if you look at the federal level. And so it makes sense. But again, I think you'll see both groups ebbing and flowing and having more responsibility. But if we're right about the trend towards investing, I think you'll see the private sector care a lot more pretty fast. If as an investment class, the S and ESG starts to catch up with the E, you will see a lot of incentives for people to be better at this.
That's great. Thank you. Another question when we have several people on the panel who've run these functions. So DE&I has traditionally been embedded within HR and structured vertically as opposed to horizontally within organizations. What's the panel's advice on where should this function report into? The CHRO, the CEO, the board, and what do you think about that evolving landscape?
I'll take a stab at that. So I purposely at ServiceNow only had 2 experts, and we capped it at 3 experts on the D&I space, Mike, because I wanted D&I owned by every leader in the organization and the board. And so each of the executives took sponsorship over one of the verticals in terms of training or recruiting or comp and fair pay and equity. So they got deep expertise in those verticals, and they were meeting regularly to understand the horizontal, the ecosystem. So it matured that muscle. I also put D&I and belonging in all the major metrics across the organization, employee life cycle. So I took the employee life cycle journey map and wove it into those moments that matter. So every manager is accountable, every tool have it. I mean, if you do it right, it should be in every moment that we live. We try to manifest a better, healthier company. And then I'm leveraging technology for those nudges to make sure that we slow our neurological roll when we hire. Do we have diverse slate, diverse panel? How are we, setting up the pay, how we promote, how we look at succession planning, all that. So we think more holistically. But long story short, I think it'll be with the CHRO. It could be to the CEO, but my point of view is that it should be really small for expertise. So it gets owned by everyone that needs to own it across the organization in the DNA.
And so at Zynga, we actually, I'm so sorry, Dane.
No, go ahead. Paul.
Okay. So at Zynga, we actually have it reporting to HR with complete access to C-staff, where the new head of DEI actually comes to our C-staff meetings and also attends board meetings. And so we take it very seriously in that way. And I think it can stay with whatever function makes sense, but allow that individual or a set of individuals to have exposure to a larger base of individuals or a base of people that they can talk about their findings with.
I was going to just say, I think way too much energy is spent on this question. And I think, both people in the space and outside of the space spend way too much weight on it relative to what matters. I will, maybe make a couple of comments. It's a deeply, deeply secondary question to how much budget do you have? So we could spend, you can report to whoever, you could have whatever, but like, what ability do you have to influence change? And there's this, general view that, hey, if I'm reporting to the CEO, I'm going to get that budget. I have not seen any correlation between that necessarily being true at all. And in fact, I think it's a great move to like make it seem serious, but not be serious. I will say that one benefit, I really agree with Pat's point of you don't want it to be too big because, used to see this a lot in diversity recruiting where they'd hire a diversity recruiting team. And I just told you that the diverse population, if you're looking at US statistics, is 2/3. So this diverse recruiting team would be like 5% of the recruiting staff. And you're like, you guys go out there and do all the diverse recruiting. So you have 5% of your resources responsible for recruiting 2/3 of the population. It doesn't work. And the rest of the organization, the other 95% is like, well, I can keep going hiring majority members. It really doesn't work. The last thing that I would say though is I also think it's too big of a job for any one person to really do across a large organization, because when you get into supplier diversity, customer consideration, there's no one person who's going to be an expert across all of those silos, or that there's one of them. There's not many of them, and so I think it's often a pretty unhelpful conversation because too much weight gets placed on it.
I agree. I think maybe we'll probably make this our last question looking at the clock here. So a question from the audience around board education, and I'll throw this open to, because all of you work with boards and are on boards yourselves. What do you think is the most important takeaway on how the board can think about its role and oversight responsibility when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as opposed to all the other areas that it's responsible for, in terms of how the board should balance oversight and its governance with management's responsibility to actually manage?
I'll take a stab. No one's jumping in on this one. I think that is where I'm learning, Mike. I'm trying to figure out what is the right balance on this, right? It is how you run the business. I mean, if you do this right, it should be the strategy. It should be the same review when you do your product roadmap strategy. You have your talent strategy, and this is part of it with your culture and, how you support your customers. And so the rigor and the cadence in which you do those things, this should be similar cadence, similar rigor. And getting that into the right cadence, regardless of which committee owns it, it's got to have that same rigor.
I would just add to that, and I agree with Pat, this is like an ongoing, evolving thing. The role of the board is to really ask questions to prompt the right behaviors. But to the extent the board feels obligated to talk about how you're responding to a changing consumer base, they should be responding to a changing employer base as well. It's the same base. It's the same human beings, right? So So to the extent that one is dynamic and constantly moving, and you wouldn't be very excited about a leadership team that said, nah, we're not going to evolve our practices when it comes to consumers. We think we've nailed this. The last 10 years are a great indication of the next 10 years. You should be asking the same questions about how people are managing the folks you're paying.
Yeah, and we talked. I just want to add one other thing to the people aspect. The employees are demanding this attention as well. They'll walk with their feet. It becomes part of the dialogue that they are asking us when they interview. It's part of the dialogue they want to prompt when they give us survey feedback every 6 months or whatever your cadence is. They will leave. They will walk with their feet if we don't address these core concerns. And so it's becoming, a pivotal business need and a cadence that we have to listen to.
Hey, Mike, maybe just one last one that'll add to me being disliked by most corporate leaders if anybody takes this advice. A super simple one. You have an agenda every time. Say from now on in the agenda, it's a 2-hour session on this. I want 10 minutes dedicated from this senior leader on what they're doing to focus on diversity within their organization. And just make the other people have to start talking about it. Don't make it a separate thing. You could still have the separate thing that looks at it at scale, but just if everybody starts to think that when I go to the board, I got to talk about what I'm doing and through the lens of what resources I'm allocating, how much I'm spending, where we have problems, where we have opportunities. If you just did that, you'll see a massive amount of motion come up. But right now, everybody feels like they have an audible to kick this conversation over to a team of like 10 in an organization of tens of thousands.
And just to be clear, as a single board member, you can be the one to ask that question of every single person that comes before you. You don't need to make it a board policy. Trust me, we knew the board members who were going to ask us the question before we came ahead. So if you just decide, hey, I'm the board member who's going to ask everybody that question until people get the point, that's enough.
Great. This is terrific advice for boards. And so in the interest of time, we'll conclude today's discussion here. I want to thank you very much, all of our panelists, for joining us today. You guys were terrific, and I know how busy you are, and really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights and perspectives. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for taking time from your schedule to be with us, and I hope you will join us for the third part of this series, which will be hosted by the University of Pennsylvania Institute, and it's being held on January 14th, 2021 at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Registration and details are on the conference website. And with that, we'll say goodbye from Stanford Law School, and thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Take care.